Twitter
it's
really...
all true, though.
It's all true.
Okay.
But it's learned through passed down history. Twitter, started in 2006, late 2006, early 2007, and really from the beginning had the API baked in, not exactly from the beginning, but very soon on. Mostly because it was built on top of Ruby on Rails, and it took a very simple change to actually expose an API out to all the developers out there. And kind of the ethos of the founders and the ethos of the company had always been around content creation and democratizing the creation of content. So for them, it was kind of a simple decision to make it available, but it wasn't like a strategic plan around exactly where this was going to go. A few developers had requested they wanted to be able to get tweets onto Mac and build a client for it. They thought that seemed like an interesting idea, so they turned it on, and it kind of exploded from there. There was one engineer at Twitter at the time named Alex Payne, and he was kind of solely responsible for this thing. He actually was the one who helped really build the community around this in the early days. So he sat up late at night, Abraham and Jazzy Chad, all these guys were very early in the ecosystem of Twitter. They'd email for changes, he'd literally make the code change, commit it to trunk, and email these guys back and say it had been changed. It was that much of kind of iterative community at the time. Obviously, that evolves many, many years later to 3 or 4 years later to now, and we're looking at hundreds of thousands of applications and a whole myriad of different ways that people use it. But it got started with very kind of simple means and simple plans.
Can you give a sense of the Twitter developer ecosystem at this point? Like, how many developers are there, and how much traffic are they bringing to Twitter?
Yeah, it's we announced we do a lot of developer events at the office where we have people come by and talk about different topics, answer questions. And a recent one we talked about, it wasn't a stat we've been tracking that closely at the time, but we found we had over 750,000 developers in the ecosystem.
Wow.
And to put that into perspective, we started actually looking around at different populations of states, and it turns out that it's more populous than Vermont. So it gives you a perspective, though, on what it means to help kind of manage that ecosystem. There's so many different needs and so many different constituents in that group that helps kind of understand the breadth of it. That same group has built, I think the latest stat we've made public is over 1.1 million registered applications in the system. And to, I think, Daniel's point earlier, we do about 15 billion API requests per day. And for us, that's a massive cost center because each of those aren't actually being paid for. But it's a cost that we want to invest in, and we look at it as kind of a long-term play for the value that ends up delivering to users.
And how big is the group inside Twitter who's managing
that?
ecosystem?
It actually, on our team specifically, this will surprise most people, we actually only have about 3 developer advocates that manage that whole ecosystem. It is hard to actually count up all of the people that work on it because it gets into the infrastructure and storage and all that kind of stuff. But our immediate team that supports them, 3 full-time developer advocates, yeah.
Wow.
We have a few engineers dedicated to the platform team that build out things like the tweet button and follow button and stuff like that. So it's a very lean team for the number of people that.
I think that's pretty neat. Do you have a sense of what kind of traffic this is driving for Twitter?
We don't really think of it in traffic in the same sense of like click-throughs and referrals and stuff like that. For us, it's about the API speaks to the myriad of ways that people can get content in the system. If Twitter's about sharing and connecting with people, we want people to be able to share no matter where they are, whether they're on the mobile phone, whether they're on the web, whether they're using Instagram, whether it's there was this thing called Baker Tweets. And it was an oven, and it was hooked up to this cell signal. And every time it actually pushed out new baked goods, it would send out a tweet to let all their followers know to come and grab baked goods at the time. So the Open API allowed for these totally emergent ways for people to share content in the system. But I think the other really interesting part too is when you look at 230 million tweets per day coming through the system, how do you allow people to get to that content and make sure the right content connects to the right person? I think that's really, those two pieces have been where the API has been most successful.
Can you give any examples of that stand out in your mind of figuring out that problem?
Yeah, I think if you look back at the early days, I think it's like app number 20 was co-tweet. So back in the very very early days, Twitter was very focused on keeping the site up, and they were building a consumer-focused site. But there were businesses that were starting to see their customers on there and seeing this entirely new way to engage with their customers. But there wasn't a kind of a commercial type interface to help them use it in a way. So if you had 7 employees trying to manage one account, Twitter.com was horrible for that. You have to share passwords, and it wasn't great. So these guys at CoTweet decided they saw this opportunity to build a tool that allowed all these businesses, small businesses, medium businesses, and eventually JetBlues and Starbucks of the world, to help engage with Twitter in a way that made sense to them.
To have a a single voice.
Exactly, yeah, so it was a tool that
multiple
really
people
helped them
behind it.
engage in a way that Twitter was never going to be focused on, especially in those early days. So I think it's important stuff like that that allows people to get content into the system, whether it's through blogs or whether it's, again, Instagrams or Foursquares, this kind of really unique content. Those have all been, I think, really interesting examples.
You throw around these incredible numbers on, user adoption and usage. What do you internally feel are the big drivers of that growth right now?
It's a good question. I think Twitter, in the way we think about it internally, it's about connecting people to their interests. And I look at it and try and think about what's important to me and the ways that I use Twitter and how I get value out of it. And for me, it's about following my friends. It's about following DJs I like, about getting news, about people in our industry, and being able to connect to all these different things in a single place that I can't get that elsewhere. I think it's creating this new medium that people aren't able to get in other places, and I think that's where we're seeing so much of the growth. We're very focused as a company on growth, though, and making sure that we reduce friction as many places as possible, from people being aware of Twitter to actually getting value out of Twitter. And I think that's a really important task and something that we're very, very focused on.
Focusing specifically on developers for a moment, you all changed some of your guidance with developers recently. There was some controversy in it. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of your learning throughout this process of engaging with developers?
Yeah, I think managing ecosystems, as many of you guys know, is it's an ongoing learning process.
They seem like a feisty bunch. I want to throw that out there for some of these presentations.
Yeah, it's an ongoing kind of learning process, especially for me, because it wasn't something I had come from before and moved into Twitter to bring learnings to.
What was your background before?
I worked in another company doing mobile location stuff, so totally different field. Still was thinking about developers, but in a very different way and at a very, very different scale. But one of the most important things we can do, and I think Stephen kind of alluded to it, is in order to work with an ecosystem, the best thing you can try and do is give guidance on where you're going. It's almost impossible, as any startup knows, to try and put out an exact roadmap of exactly what's coming every single week. One, it's dynamic and it changes when you
might not know
react to the market. We have a pretty good idea of where we're going, but it does need to be dynamic. And the worst thing to do is set something out there as a roadmap, let people think that that's static, and then change it. So instead, we try and think more thematically, where are we investing, and where are we going to spend and focus our time and share that with the community. And I think we could have done, a much, much better job of the way we communicated. But I think I really stand behind, and I think it was the right guidance to give that we were going to be investing in a consumer experience. We look back, and actually I think Daniel's talked about it with Netflix too. We looked back in, probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and saw that our mobile growth wasn't growing at the same speed that we knew it probably should be growing with the growth of the iPhone and growth of Android. And we started doing a bunch of user research. And we sat down with a bunch of users and had them pick up an iPhone. They weren't Twitter users at this point. They were just people who heard about Twitter and were interested, and said, search for Twitter. You've heard about Twitter on the radio or on TV, and you want to connect with Twitter. And they would go into the App Store, they'd search for Twitter, they'd see a bunch of apps that didn't look, or that kind of looked like Twitter, but didn't say Twitter, and she'd set the phone down. And that was kind of our aha moment of oh my gosh, we're losing this user for everyone, right? That user is someone who we can't even bring to the rest of the ecosystem. That user is someone we can't connect to the rest of their fans. So it was really important for us at that moment. We decided to really invest in that kind of core experience in every one of those platforms and drive that vision forward. And we've seen extensive and huge mobile growth since that point. So I think that was the right decision back at the time. We knew that would have downstream effects, and our job was to get out there and communicate that. I think while guidance is important, you can't just talk about the areas where you're going. I think it's really important to spend time with your partners and your brands and the people that are using Twitter as a platform, not just the APIs, and bring the thematic things you learn from them about the things that they need to be able to engage with Twitter, like a co-tweet type thing. And bring that to great entrepreneurs, and bring that to the hackers, and bring that to the indie developers, and show them where these kind of pockets of opportunity are. And we've invested a lot of kind of time and resources over the past, multiple 2 years, but especially this past year, around doing more and more developer events to help kind of communicate that message. So as we're talking to the JetBlues and the Starbucks and the Home Depots and the Coca-Colas, where are they finding friction in engaging with Twitter, and where can we bring the ecosystem to those opportunities?
So in that sense, you become kind of the intermediary voice,
right? Yeah,
between the two,
there's needs,
saying
and exactly.
What are some of the other big opportunities you see for developers?
Yeah, I think we break it down kind of into 5 areas, and these I wouldn't say are totally comprehensive of every opportunity, but it's the ones that we kind of hear about the most. One is analytics. So a huge thing is trying to we have this kind of crazy global consciousness. Again, 230 million tweets per day. How do you help a big brand or even a small company make sense of what's being talked about on Twitter for their brand?
And distinguish the noise from the signal.
Exactly. Is it positive sentiment? Is it negative? What should I react to? What shouldn't I? So analytics, I think, is a huge opportunity, and one that even though there's tons of companies in that space, I think we hear more and more that they want more of it. And there's so many different ways to slice it. Actually, Eric Schmidt had a great comment that analytics is infinitely monetizable, and I think that we've seen that true. And also, we look at the kind of guidance versus the areas of opportunity. Around that exact same time, we gave the guidance. Salesforce was here, acquired Radian 6 for $326 million, and that's the type of thing we want to bring to the ecosystem. Say this is the opportunity you could be building. And instead of trying to focus on that same core experience, look at these other areas where there's great opportunities for exits or for just great sustainable businesses. Mm-hmm. So analytics is a huge one. With the Olympics, both domestically and internationally this year, and with elections domestically and internationally, and then Olympics this year, there's huge needs around curation. So we have all of this content coming around. How do we help find that great signal amongst all the noise to help bring up, the Obama Town Hall. We work with a partner called Mass Relevance, who's based in Austin, Texas, really small team. They helped us find these tweets from constituents around the U.S. that had great questions for the president, and we brought those questions to the president using a third-party tool. So I think those are the types of opportunities we want to see more and more people building into. So curation, analytics, content, which I think of kind of as the Instagrams and the Quoras, bringing really unique content and getting that into the stream. Publishing, there's a great company called Social Flow that helps companies like The Economist or Forbes who have great online content figure out how to get it into Twitter.
Forbes, by the way, I appreciate that.
But take all of this content you guys have online on your site and get it into Twitter in a way that resonates with your audience instead of just kind of blindly throwing it out there. And what was the last one? I had a fifth one, but I can't remember right now.
If it comes, you can throw it out there. Well, what are some of your favorites when you look at this large pool of developers working with Twitter? Do you have favorites that you think are taking really creative approaches given the data that Twitter does have, but maybe isn't entirely obvious, the stuff that's below the surface?
Yeah, I think there's actually Social Flow, I already mentioned, is a really interesting one, and people who haven't seen them, I really encourage you to go check them out. They help look at the Forbes followers, see what they're talking about in real time, and try and match that up with the content you have in the queue. So say someone's really interested in Tunisia or Egypt right now, where we have a story queued up for that. Let's send that out now as opposed to later, or as opposed to another story that might not be as of much interest to the audience. Cloud, who's been mentioned here a lot, I think is a Mashery customer, is one of my favorites. They were also a really early developer, started with a very small group of developers with an idea, and they've taken this great signal out of Twitter, and in the fifth category is what we call enterprise, and using that data, they've been able to help all these big companies, Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or whoever, be able to figure out who the right people on Twitter are to engage with. And that's a really, really important thing. You look at the kind of vastness of Twitter, all the people.
Yeah, well, that's key in helping the noise signal issue. It's who matters.
Yeah. There's another third one that I find fascinating, and it's a company called Data Miner out of New York. It's a huge team of quant scientists, and they look for using social content as a signal that might be a leading indicator for markets. So their whole job is to try and beat the Bloomberg terminals by letting them know about market movement ahead of time. And while they're focused on a sector that obviously that has a lot of money in terms of hedge funds and investment, that same technology, those same concepts can easily be brought to news or to content in a number of different verticals.
Do you think that's possible to read the market based on?
They have some awesome case studies showing from Osama bin Laden to the Oslo bombings to a bunch of the stuff where they've beaten Bloomberg in the AP by about 15, 16 minutes, which in market time is huge.
Yeah, that's pretty phenomenal. Well, thanks very much for joining us. And we stand in between the people and their drinks, so we should probably get out of the way. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I hope it was insightful and interesting, and I hope you all enjoyed chatting outside where you were earlier today and having some drinks.
Thank you.